of curiosity, while I'm pulling up some websites, show of hands, how many of you guys are in the design-related professions at all? Architecture, planning, design at all? Okay, this is going to be fun then. So I'm an architect. While I preface a lot of what I'm about to pull up and show you guys, I actually attended KU from 2004 to 2009. I actually was fortunate enough to play basketball while I was here. Got a master's in architecture at this building and went on to graduate school in urban design, worked for a number of years, was really dissatisfied with how architecture works with communities, and have come back to teach and work doing community design work, mostly in Wyandotte County. So let me find a couple of links and then I'll get started. But for those of you that don't know where Wyandotte County is, it's northeast Kansas City, Kansas. It is a very diverse community. It's one of the most diverse communities in the country. It has, I think, no, I guess you could say no ethnic majority. It's something like 42% white, 28% African American, 25% Latino, and it's the area that's been most impacted by white flight in the Kansas City region. And with that comes a lot of historic health inequities, and a lot of what I do as a doctoral student in architecture is focus on community and health. And so I'm going to try to pull up these videos. I think I already got them lined up on the desktop, so but I just want to give that as a background because it's very relevant to what I'm doing, but it's not something I'm going to focus on too much. Why is that not coming up on a website? Open with, there we go. That's what I wanted. So a couple years ago, I started working with a couple School of Architecture professors, Shannon, Chris, and Niels Gore. Does this work? No? Okay. And we co-founded a little group called Dot Agency. It's this idea called Spatial Agency, which comes from this notion that there's the top-down process of how cities get built, there's the bottom-up process of how communities operate. We wanted to be in that middle territory where a lot of the work we do is translational. We work with communities to, somebody might say, hey, I got an idea for a community garden, an urban farm. We help them draw that. Our students help us kind of get that work done. We build that, and then we go out, and sometimes what we build or what we draw doesn't work for the city. And so we reinterpret that, we reiterate on it, we prototype, and we make it until it works. And so we do that collectively through the three of us. Shannon, Chris, and Niels Gore are the other two professors. And like any good doctoral student in architecture, I got to start with the philosophy, right? So Martin Heidegger and his work, and architects really like Heidegger because he talks about design, but not design, but it sounds close enough that we kind of like how it's talked about. But for those of you that aren't familiar, it's this idea that this is, like he tried to really solve what does it mean to be a human? And design literally translates in German to like being there, being present. And so he thought he could understand design through this kind of experiential way of thinking about it. And so for most of us, we'd look at this and as a classic example, he'd say, well, is the jug an empty jug? And we'd all say, sure. But he said, well, if a scientist saw that, they might say there's millions of air molecules in the center of that jug, and it's not truly empty. But the only reason we can talk about it that way is because we have a shared language. We have a shared understanding that scientists could talk to us and say, well, this is what's going on, and we could talk back and say, well, this is what I see, and after a while, we kind of come to some sort of consensus. And the reason we do that, Heidegger argues, is that it helps us build things, whether it's an individual's life, whether it's the concepts that we all study, or whether it's actual buildings. We can build things through a shared language. And the reason we want to build things is because gets to this very like innate desire within all human beings to have dwelling, right? We all want to dwell. We want to create our lives. We want to create the environments around us. What he doesn't talk about is what happens when the process of dwelling and building is so disconnected from an individual that they don't have that shared language anymore. They don't understand how a city gets built, how a neighborhood works. And so examples we see that in recent history of redlining. This is not a map of Kansas City, Kansas, but this is what Kansas City, Kansas basically looks like. It's covered in pink and what used to be red, and that's because this is a redlining map. And for those of you that aren't familiar, redlining map was a federal mortgage program that basically divided up neighborhoods, and they defined them based on race. Not based on anything else, but based on race. And that was a correlate to say where banks could lend. And what you end up getting is a systemic disinvestment in majority and minority neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that were mostly black did not get lending, did not get mortgages. So we see the disinvestment. And that ripples to things like grocery stores. A lot of the work I do is on food access. My PhD is really about food access and storytelling, and I'll get to that a little bit. But we see neighborhoods that no longer have the capacity to have grocery stores. In Wyandotte County, there's a neighborhood I work with where 20,000 residents don't have a grocery store within a walking distance. The closest one by bus is about 36 minutes. The next closest is 45 minutes. And this is 20,000 residents. We talk about rural food deserts too, but those are typically about 3,000 to 4,000. This is an urban area, an urban center that does not have a grocery store and hasn't had one in 30 years. You talk about Flint, Michigan, right? Where water. How do you talk about this idea that you can't get fresh water if you're so disconnected from the process? Not only does this happen, but any house built before the Clean Water Act in 1986 likely has lead in either the paint or in the pipes. And so in Flint, Michigan, we know that that's affected 6,000 to 12,000 children. That has impacts, if you look at the research, based on violent crime. Violent crime after 1986, because of the Clean Water Act, dropped 56%. Because lead was taken out of household items, and now we're reintroducing it back. And so there's this disconnect between the citizen and the individual and what they can achieve in their community, largely because how do you develop a shared language? How do you talk about this as an issue? So historically, that's actually not totally rare. We've seen that in programs like the Model City program, where it was designed when HUD was created. Lyndon Johnson signed it into law in 1966. They said, well, we want to have a Model Cities program that talks about citizen participation, talks about social service programs, and also talks about urban redevelopment. The flaw they made is they made it go through this kind of top-down agency at each city, not directly to the communities. And while it was a great program to build up African-American leadership in urban communities, it didn't always address the needs. For those of you interested in urban planning, I would recommend reading Sherry Arnstein's A Ladder of Citizen Participation, where she talks about, she brings up this report that came up in 1969 on a report on the model cities, basically saying that none of this was done in participation with residents. The majority of it, I think she only found one example where the residents actually started with ownership. About a dozen demanded ownership, and the rest never had ownership at all. And so the quote they use is that by and large, people are once again being planned for, not with, but for. And that's not, again, unique. Paul Davidoff in Urban Planning talks about how it's a really good idea for urban planners to start working with communities. And so he had this whole theory on advocacy and pluralism in planning. Related to that, in architecture, we see a guy named Giancarlo De Carlo. He's a part of what's called Team 10, very famous, influential architecture group. And he said architecture is too important to be left to architects. He also predicted, I would argue rightfully so, that this wouldn't take, that professionals and academics would resist giving away their authority as experts to communities, because we've built up so many years of education, we have those credentials, we have our letters behind our name. It's not going to ever change overnight. And so he said it's going to be really hard to get this done. But when we go to other fields, we start to see different things happening. So I'm fortunate at KU Architecture, I actually have a very weird PhD. I kind of get a dabble from every school, and so it's interdisciplinary by nature. And so I've learned about Shoshana Zuboff is a Harvard PhD professor, and she was really interested in this idea of the disconnection in work. And so she was looking at how factories switching over to computer systems, there was a lot of knowledge that was built up by the factory workers. They had tacit knowledge. They knew what the job was and they knew how to do it. And they were really afraid that a computer was going to wipe them out. We still talk about this today. But when computers first came on, it was really prevalent. And so one of the things that started happening is ethnographers started working and observing the actions of the workers to redefine how the user interface systems and technology helped pull them up and say, hey, you as a worker, your knowledge, your skills can be translated in the interfaces so that when you do your job on a computer, it's not that different from when you were doing it before, so you're not going to lose your job. You're not going to lose your benefits. And that ethnography as a field, I can't even scratch the surface of it because I'm not the right person to talk about it, but what I found really fascinating is that in qualitative research methods, I really look for something that's more rigorous as a doctoral student, but what I found appreciative is that instead of validity, you look for veracity. Does this succeed in its depiction of the phenomenon? Instead of reliability, look at objectivity. Is it transcend to the perspectives of the individuals involved? Instead of generalizability, look at purpose, I can't even say it. Can the insights from the research be applied elsewhere? And so a great example of this was actually the Scandinavian workers of the 1970s. They invited the ethnographers to join them and help tell their story. And in so doing, they actually coined, or the historians that look back at it, they coined participatory design. And so participatory design is a lot of what the work I do today is on. And as architects, both in academia and out in the profession, we're starting to see a shift towards design for people, design for communities. And you see sometimes in kind of the graphic design world with groups like IDEO, if you're familiar with IDEO, they have branded the heck out of human-centered design. This is their MO. They know it in and out. It's really good stuff. It's about iteration. It's really what we now consider design thinking. How do you go through a process? How do you work with communities? How do you work with individuals? How do you refine the idea and rapidly prototype it until it's right? What's funny for me as looking at technology is a lot of what I think is fascinating is also in the low-tech area. And so this is a Professor Liz Sanders, but there's other urban planners that do this. A guy named James Rojas does this in LA, is that they're also building tools that help provide shared language with communities. And so the tools themselves become the means by which we can facilitate a conversation about larger issues that we otherwise might not have the tools to talk about them. And so Liz Sanders put together this spreadsheet, and she said it's going to evolve, and I think it will. But in the top, she kind of says there's a design-led, and on the left, there's expert mindset. So a lot of what we see in design and architecture is up here. It's this very thoughtful, very poignant, I'm the designer, I'm going to figure it out. And then as you kind of go down the list, you see the IDEO groups who are looking more at research, and they're down here. Human factor, ergonomics, we can study, we can observe. Whereas if you go more towards the participatory mindset, you start to get things like generative tools. Storytelling, I think, fits in that category. Stories are still design kind of focused, but they're more about more people than just the expert. And somewhere down here is this idea that, well, you could do both. You could have research-led and it be participatory. And so storytelling, I think architecture needs to shift that way. I think community designs specifically can shift that way. And I think we can pull together other elements. So the Scandinavian model, the applied ethnography, storytelling. And that gets to this idea that it can be design, or design, as Heidegger would call it, advocacy. And so it's evidence-based. It's not research-led, but it's evidence-based because it generally deals with public health, at least in the world that we're in. And it's participatory throughout. And so based on kind of principles of what is good participatory design, as a doctoral student, I try to refine them and say, well, if it's good, it does four things. It empowers participants to co-create their space. There's a continuous reflection between the participants and the experts and the researchers. The participants can help determine the goals of the project before it starts, usually, is best. And a shared language gets developed, usually through artifacts, prototypes, and other visual expressions. And so with the work we do at Dot Agency, I kind of wanted to bring up in this paper the four things that I typically have had experience in the last couple of years since we've started this. KJ method is actual method in participatory consensus building, but we do it on maps, so we call it KJ mapping. Participatory budgeting is coming from this urban planning, public administration field where you can kind of use monopoly money to vote on what things we need to fund and to what extent. Photovoice is in the community-based participatory research world where Photovoice is a great way to talk about public health issues. And then community film workshop is the really kind of crux of what I want to present today. But it's something that I've been working on for the last about year or so. And so just looking at these, how do they rank and how do they fall out, and whether they empower the participants, they allow for reflection, they're collaboratively determined, and do they share languages. So an example of KJ method, we're working on a study right now with 5 urban neighborhoods in Kansas City, Kansas and Missouri, with LISC, which is a CDFI. They lend to a low-income project, affordable housing, things like that. And so we have the neighborhood leaders coming together and helping us map out where issues are in the community, and the color coding helps us visually identify very quickly. We have neighborhood association meetings that we attend regularly where residents can tell us what's going on in their neighborhood. We entice folks to come up with free popsicles. And we get stories that are intergenerational. We have kids and seniors coming up, and oftentimes one of the big barriers you hear is people say, well, we don't talk to the kids in our community, or we don't talk to the seniors in our community. But this is a nice way to get stories from both sides and say, well, what would you like? Where would you like a park? And so in terms of how that stacks out, it doesn't always empower residents, but it allows for a little bit of reflection because we keep bringing it back to the neighborhood. They keep validating the process. The neighborhood helped us set the goals for this project, which is really great because it kind of gets us on the right track early on. And we start to develop a shared language about certain neighborhoods and characteristics. Related to the work I do, we also started a mobile grocery store. And I kept getting questions about, why are you doing it the way you're doing it? You shouldn't do it that way. So I said, I'm going to put it to the people and let them vote. And so one of the questions was, what are you going to stock? And so we gave people monopoly money. This is a community health worker who was helping us. The woman in the red doesn't speak English, and she was still able to participate because it was very transparent. The way we facilitated the exercise, he could help her tell us how many fruits or vegetables you want with Monopoly money. And we've taken it into different environments with like low-income housing senior projects where folks who have a lot of challenges don't have access to food. And from that, we get quantitative data that builds up to the qualitative aspect of not just the story, but also, well, what does it mean? And right now, we're currently building that mobile market with our design, architecture, and design build students. And eventually, it's going to go back in front of a community advisory board who's going to help us pick the routes, help us pick the locations, and help us name the mobile market itself. So we have community participatory throughout. So it's empowering the community to take ownership on this food access issue, and it helps develop a shared language because now we can talk about things we couldn't talk about before. And I'm going to keep speeding up because I'm running out of time. Photovoice, if you haven't been aware of it, it's a really great public health process, but it's really about giving resident leaders and neighborhood representatives cameras, and they help tell stories about maybe how they prepare food or how difficult it is to walk in their neighborhoods. It does some really interesting things, and I'm not going to go through each one, but you can kind of see how it ranks out. And then this is the project I really wanted to share with you all, and it's the Photovoice modified for a larger participatory audience that also includes video. And so I interviewed about 7 neighborhood association presidents, 4 kids, and we had 2.5 hours of combined footage. And we asked their neighborhood to watch it, and they not only watched all of it, but they stayed for an extra hour afterwards to have discussion because they wanted to be there. And they filled out this worksheet that we had. We had about 35 residents arrive. And I'm going to play this short 2-minute video. And this was just one short snippet of what we had.
The streets, not able to get it out. My neighborhood, the streets, my neighborhood, been in out there now 56 years, and they've never asphalt my streets. The original curbs and sidewalks are there. We got one place in my neighborhood, where the sidewalk is busted, so the kids that use boards and skateboard, they use the sidewalks and drive around because the tree had buckled or something that buckled the sidewalk that bad. I got no pictures of it. The kids are one time we picking up 27 tires of being dumped in our neighborhood. They leave it done. And I'm trying to get people to see somebody leave it done. Call the police, call 911 and let them know that they leave it done. I know it can't be done overnight, but they need to make an effort to do something to the sidewalks, the curbs, the alleys and stuff inside. I've got 3 abandoned houses down at the ground on fire. And then I start calling right now. We got 3 houses on C-Cruise down that were burned. That's been sitting there that I'm sure the city knew about it. Nobody pushed it and got it done. They are gone there. But there's other stuff that needs to be done. And my goal is my senior citizens. Because with the young kids, we can work in these things with the senior citizens can't do. So it's making it with our senior citizens to make it easier for them. When we were looking at here in the summer, working with some kids, we were going to adopt certain senior citizens houses, or we can keep their yards, plant some people hours. It might be enough people who are looking at school system, come up and paint the house, do the picture, and be self-sufficient, and not depend on the outside of those who become let us take our kids out the room and do it ourselves.
We are mid-time.
I think there was another video going on in the back. Yeah. Sorry about that. I don't know where it is. This is it. So you got a little bit of Victor talking. Sorry about that. But there was apparently in the background playing, you just couldn't hear it until we turned the volume up. These are all the videos. Now they all exist online. Clifford, Pam, Beverly, Wanda, all the neighborhood leaders have their videos online. And so what I've done is I've edited them. We've shared them with multiple neighborhood groups. We've shared them with the city and other neighborhood organizations. And so when we were using this worksheet, we were able to actually determine it, because one of the things I didn't want to do is I didn't want to be the only only person editing this video. I didn't want to be the only person whose job it was to edit. So we actually used the feedback from the community in sharing it with them and using different survey as they watched, they filled it out, they gave us their feedback, they told us what aspects of the videos they liked, what they didn't like, and our neighborhood association leader, Rachel Jefferson, was able to work and turn this into a very interesting process where she's now advocating for the community in their master plan, which has its first meeting on Monday. So they pushed for her to have representation in this process, and in fact, a couple of the residents who she met through this process are now advocating for her on behalf of the city, saying that we need her to be a leader. And so this last slide talks about the idea of how it empowers communities, and I think it's something that it's a part of my PhD dissertation, but as it goes forward, I want to continue to refine it and build it towards something that's even more empowering and more effective for communities. And the last couple slides, I know my time's up, but we just last week finished building up trails based on the impact of the video, and we had, based on Victor's feedback, kids coming out, putting in new signage, and building up the neighborhood towards that end. So thank you. And I got another 45-second clip, but I know my time's up, so. I can show the clip when everyone leaves. How about that? If you guys want to watch another clip, it's from this project. I'd be happy to show it. I know. I was going fast because I was on time crunch. Yeah, I'd be more than happy to share with you, and I can give you, anyone that wants, I can give you a card. And our group is .agency, D-O-T-T-E, agency, and it's .agency.org is our website. So yeah, we have a lot of partners and a lot of different efforts, and a lot of what we do is community health design, but storytelling is such a big part of that.
Thank you so much. Coffee is, I think there's still coffee in the back room, and we'll take a 15-minute break.
And I will show my other video if that helps.